Never let an entitled suburban HOA president with a laminated rulebook and a profound lack of geography common sense try to order you to dismantle a private dock on a body of water she doesn't own. For 3 generations, my family hasn't just owned the rustic cabin sitting on the shoreline, we legally own the entire spring-fed lakebed beneath it. Every drop of water, every foot of shoreline sediment, and every single timber of that multi-tiered boat dock belongs to us. But when the ultra-exclusive Whispering Pines subdivision was built up around our perimeter, their new homeowners association forgot one tiny, vital detail. Public access didn't include our private water. Enter Brenda Miller. Brenda was the reigning queen of neighborhood complaints, a woman who wore oversized Gucci sunglasses and treated every square inch of the landscape as her personal architectural playground. Last Saturday morning, I was sitting on my front porch sipping black coffee when I heard the aggressive tapping of designer heels on my wooden walkway. I walked down to the water, just in time to see Brenda shoving a thick, laminated HOA infraction sticker directly onto my custom cedar railing. "Mr. Hayes," Brenda barked, crossing her arms and sneering at my prized fishing boat, bobbing in the water. "The board has received multiple complaints about your asymmetrical dock, ruining the community's sunset aesthetic. You have 48 hours to demolish it and clear the water, or the HOA will send a contractor to rip it out at your expense." She stood there blinking at me, completely serious, expecting me to panic. She genuinely thought my private property was subject to her neighborhood bylaws. Most people would have shouted. Most people would have pulled out a deed and started a screaming match. Instead, I took a slow sip of my coffee, looked her dead in the eye, and smiled. "Demolish my dock," I whispered smoothly. "Brenda, before you call a contractor, you might want to check who actually owns the water your subdivision was built around." Her smug expression froze instantly. She had no idea what was coming. Brenda let out a sharp, dismissive laugh, tossing her blonde hair over her shoulder like she was swatting away a fly. "Oh, please, spare me the backcountry fairy tales, Hayes," Brenda snapped, tapping her manicured fingernails against her phone screen. "Whispering Pines subdivision borders this lake, which means county zoning dictates what happens on the shoreline. My husband already hired a marine demolition crew. That eyesore of a dock is coming down by Monday morning, whether you like it or not." She spun around on her designer heels, clicked back up the wooden path, and drove off in her luxury SUV, completely convinced she held all the cards. She didn't know a damn thing about 19th century land grants. Back in 1894, my great-grandfather purchased not only the timber acreage, but the absolute riparian and waterbed rights to Lake Silverwood, a legally binding deed registered with the state Supreme Court that explicitly bars any municipal or HOA jurisdiction from altering the aquatic ecosystem without our explicit written consent. By Sunday evening, I had our legal binder out, flanked by heavy-duty brass security chains, underwater motion sensors, and a framed copy of the original state land patent mounted right by the boathouse entrance. Monday at 8 a.m. sharp, the tranquility of the morning mist was shattered by the roaring diesel engine of a massive commercial marine salvage barge. It motored straight across the lake, hauling heavy hydraulic cranes and wrecking equipment, flying the Whispering Pines HOA logo right on its bow. Marcus, Brenda's wealthy corporate husband, stood on the deck, wearing a brand-new captain's hat, holding a megaphone, and pointing directly at my family's heirloom dock. The heavy steel grappling hook slammed into my custom cedar piling with a sickening crunch, but Marcus's premature victory celebration was about to hit a brick wall of absolute legal reality. Marcus grabbed his megaphone, his voice booming across the glassy surface of the water. "Last warning, Hayes. Drop the Property Line Act, or we tear the whole thing to splinters." I didn't flinch. I calmly reached into my jacket, pulled out the original state-certified water rights folio embossed with its heavy gold seal, and held it up high for the barge crew to see. "Go ahead and pull, Marcus," I called out across the water, my voice carrying clearly over the diesel roar. "Every inch of that cable you anchor into my lakebed is an unauthorized commercial trespass on private riparian estate. Current toll? $2,000 per minute, plus immediate equipment impoundment. Marcus laughed into his megaphone, waving off the warning like it was a mosquito bite. "Total hearsay! Tear it down!" he roared to his captain. The crane operator yanked the primary lever. The heavy winch whined, and the steel cable bit deep into the cedar wood, putting tension on the pilings. But the moment that cable locked onto my private lakebed, a flashing red strobe light mounted on my boathouse roof roared to life. Simultaneously, across the lake, the automated security and vehicle gates at the main entrance of the Whispering Pines subdivision slammed shut, locking down every single resident inside the neighborhood. Marcus's radio crackled to life instantly. His lead contractor's face went completely white as emergency digital asset freeze notifications flooded his phone screen. Because by anchoring heavy commercial machinery into my private waterbed, they had just triggered an automatic state-mandated asset lien across the entire Whispering Pines community infrastructure. Marcus dropped his megaphone in sheer horror, his captain staring in disbelief at the dashboard monitors. And then, rounding the misty point of the cove, a state environmental police patrol boat cut through the water, its blue lights flashing blindingly in the morning sun. Officer Henderson didn't waste a single second. He stepped lightly from the patrol boat onto the deck of Marcus's barge, completely ignoring the wealthy executive's expensive captain's hat. "Cut the engine," Officer Henderson ordered, resting his hand casually on his citation belt. "State Department of Natural Resources. You are operating heavy commercial excavation equipment within a protected private riparian sanctuary without state-cleared riparian zoning permits." Marcus's face drained of color. He stammered, pointing frantically toward the shore. That's ridiculous!" "My wife's homeowners association cleared." "Your wife's homeowners association has zero jurisdiction over private water deeds dating back to 1894, the officer interrupted flatly. "That violation alone carries a mandatory $5,000 environmental fine per hour of operation. And look at your anchors. You've dragged industrial cables right across a protected fish-spawning bed." Across the water, the screech of tires echoed off the tree line. Brenda's luxury SUV fishtailed down the gravel access road, coming to a violent stop at the edge of our shoreline. She flung the door open, sprinting toward the water's edge in her designer heels, screaming at the top of her lungs. "Officer, arrest him!" Brenda shrieked, pointing a manicured finger directly at me as I stood safely on my porch with my coffee. "He's holding our contractor hostage and illegally trapping our community!" Officer Henderson turned slowly, looking from a sweating Marcus to a frantic Brenda, and then back to the digital lien tracker on my phone screen. The total financial damage was already sitting at a cool $34,000 and climbing by the second. And then, cutting through the morning air, a deafening chorus of car horns erupted up the lane. A long convoy of angry Whispering Pines residents had just arrived at the gates, demanding to know why their community emergency funds were frozen to bail out Brenda's illegal dock demolition. The homeowner mutiny was swift, merciless, and absolute. Whispering Pines residents had already watched their maintenance fees dry up, and discovering that Brenda had weaponized association funds for a personal vendetta against a private lake owner was the final straw. Right there on the shoreline, emergency votes were cast. Before noon, Brenda was officially stripped of her board seat, her executive privileges revoked, and her name scrubbed from every community document. Marcus, realizing his corporate bluff had completely evaporated, dropped his pen on the barge deck and surrendered. He looked across the water at me, his arrogant executive posture entirely gone. "How much?" Marcus shouted across the lake, his voice cracking with panic. "Name your price, to drop the liens and clear the barge." I walked down to the edge of my dock, resting my hands on the timber railing. "It's not just about money anymore, Marcus," I replied calmly. "You tore up a protected spring-fed lakebed and ignored a century-old land deed. That's a federal environmental breach." Before Marcus could plead his case, Officer Henderson stepped forward, pulling a crisp white federal summons from his breast pocket. He didn't hand it to Marcus. Instead, he walked over to the shoreline and handed a secondary criminal citation directly to a trembling Brenda. Brenda stared down at the paper, her designer sunglasses slipping down her nose in sheer horror. She wasn't just facing fines, she was facing criminal charges for illegal dock destruction and ecological vandalism on protected private property. And just as Brenda opened her mouth to scream another protest, a second environmental enforcement boat rounded the cove, carrying heavy towing anchors and flashing bright amber warning lights. The towing operation wasn't just swift, it was a public spectacle, watched by every single homeowner trapped behind the gated community's frozen electronic barriers. Marcus stood on the deck of his immobilized barge, watching the state environmental crew hook heavy steel tow lines to his prized vessel. Every passing minute added thousands of dollars to an escalating total that his corporate salary couldn't possibly absorb without liquidating personal assets. Meanwhile, Brenda trudged back up the gravel access road on foot, her designer heels snapping off one by one in the dirt, completely stripped of her community power, her dignity, and her neighborhood allies. No one offered her a ride. No one looked her in the eye. By late Tuesday afternoon, the Whispering Pines Board sent emergency legal counsel down to our cabin to negotiate an immediate, unconditional surrender. They realized that if the federal environmental lawsuit proceeded, the entire subdivision's common property and reserve funds would be legally seized by the court. The settlement terms were absolute and non-negotiable. First, the HOA wired $100,000 directly into our state-regulated Environmental Restoration Fund to repair the lakebed disruption. Second, Marcus and Brenda were legally barred from ever setting foot within 500 yards of the shoreline or holding any public office in the state again. Third, and most satisfyingly, our original cedar dock had to be rebuilt twice as large, entirely at Marcus's personal expense, using professional labor supervised by our family's estate lawyer. As the sun began to dip below the mountain ridge, casting a brilliant orange glow across the glassy water, the commercial barge was towed away in total disgrace. I stood on my newly reinforced cedar dock, took a slow, peaceful sip of my evening coffee, and watched the ripples fade across the lake. Peace has a price, and sometimes that price is paid in full by the very people who thought they could rewrite the law from a suburban boardroom. The fallout from the dock incident reshaped Whispering Pines in ways Marcus and Brenda could never have imagined. By the end of the month, Brenda had put her luxury home up for sale and moved out of the state, her social standing completely obliterated. Marcus was left drowning in personal legal debt, facing criminal indictments for environmental vandalism, and permanently ostracized by the neighbors he once tried to rule with an iron fist. The new HOA leadership learned a profound, permanent respect for heritage property boundaries. They even installed a plaque near the community entrance, acknowledging the historical sovereignty of our land. A year later, the new HOA president walked down our gravel path, not with threats or an arrogant sneer, but with a respectful nod and a request to coordinate community events. I welcomed him warmly, because true power doesn't come from a title or a neighborhood rulebook. It comes from standing your ground when entitled bullies try to take what isn't theirs. As I stood on the extended, perfectly built cedar dock watching the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and deep crimson, I knew one thing for certain: never mess with someone who owns the lake.